I'm Brady Blevins with the Atheist Christian Book Club, a club that meets once a month to discuss the most important issues. We share a meal and have a respectful and thoughtful dialogue about the most important issues. This month we're looking at the book Cold Case Christianity, and we have a very special guest with us. We have the author of Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace. He's also authored a couple of other books, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, to name a few. And what's unique about him is he is a retired Los Angeles County cold case detective. In fact, you may recognize him. You may have seen him on the show Dateline. He's been featured on Dateline 5 times, more than any other cold case detective in the country. And J. Warner Wallace, I am excited to have you here today, man. Thank you for being here and being with us at our club.
Yeah, glad to be here. Looking forward to it. I have been all week.
Well, we've had a couple of questions come in from some of our club members, and so I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it and start sharing these questions with you. The very first question, it's really a question that two of our guys had, but I'm going to go ahead and read. It's Bill Cluck. He's the co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club. And now, before I ask you this question, before I relay this question from Bill to you, I just got to let you know up front that Bill has an unreciprocated love from Bart Ehrman. And there's a whole backstory behind it. It's kind of been our little inside joke. So let me go ahead and read his question to you.
Okay.
And he said this. He said, given that the majority of scholars place the date of the Gospels from 30 to 60 years after Christ, why should you lean on your own understanding and not trust in Bart Ehrman?
Well, it seems I'm probably like a lot of your skeptics who are reading these books, is that you certainly wouldn't you wouldn't lean on the understanding of any expert I would trot out in front of you from the Christian side. And I would understand that absolutely. I mean, experts are looking at facts, and from those facts, they're drawing inferences. So we could either look back at the facts together, or we could just trust on the inference made by an expert on one side or an expert on the other. In jury trials, we will bring experts in to speak in front of a jury. But in the end, the jurors don't really necessarily just consider, because remember, we're going to have an expert that's going to say the best inference from this evidence is this. And then the defense is going to draw an expert who's going to say, well, actually, no, the best inference from this evidence is something else entirely. So the juries have got to figure out, well, which of these two experts then should we trust? And how they're going to do that is they're going to go back to the facts, back to the evidences from which these two experts are drawing inferences to see if the evidence itself is worthy of the inference, or the inference is worthy of the evidence. So I would say that I'm not going to rely on experts to make my case. I'm going to go back to the evidence, and I'm going to do my best to make a reasonable inference from the data. So here, it's not so much that, remember, Bart had a mentor. Bart was trained up by one of the best biblical scholars of the last century. His name is Bruce Metzger. And Bruce was his mentor. He deferred a lot to Bruce. He thought the world of Bruce. He wrote a book with Bruce. He examined a lot of his first initial explorations were at the side of Bruce Metzger. And these two experts, with the exact same data points, the exact same manuscript evidence that they were looking at, Bruce was completely aware of everything that Bart is aware of. Bart is not aware of anything that Bruce wasn't aware of. And these two experts fall in entirely two different camps when it comes to their inferences from the manuscript evidence. Bart is a skeptic. He's not a Christian. Bruce was a very committed Christian and an ordained pastor as a result of his exploration. And when challenged on it, Bruce would say, look, I'm as skeptical as anybody. I have been skeptical my entire I've dug through this, and I believe it's true based on the evidence. So again, what we have here we can pull up any number of experts, and the very man that Bart relied on as his mentor doesn't believe the same things that Bart believes. So in the end, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, regardless of what any expert says about the dating of the Gospels. I'm going to ask myself, well, what is that inference based on? What is the evidence that they are basing their inference on? I want to go back to that and see if I agree with the inference. Not so much. So I'm not really interested in what the inferences are. I'm interested in the data points from which we draw inferences.
Gotcha. Very good. We had two different club members. Chris and Ken both asked a real similar question, so I've kind of merged their questions together. And it says this. If the same principles that guide cold case investigations are supposed to guide our investigation into the resurrection, why are there different standards for when supernatural causation should be considered?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what different standards are. I think that we look at cause and causes and causality, and we look at what the actual effects are, and we try to figure out which is the most reasonable cause that would explain these effects. So I'm not quite sure that there's a different standard necessarily.
Well, let me ask you this, and maybe this will help clear up the question.
Okay.
Have you ever appealed to a miracle to explain what happened in a cold case?
Okay, so what we do in all of our looking at a set of evidences in a crime scene is we begin with the simplest causal factors, and then we move toward those. And by the way, if the evidence does not point to those, the quickest, I mean, cops are lazy, I'll be honest with you. If we're going to take this guy to jail tonight, so if we get to a scene and we go, wow, this looks like somebody who lived with her. Well, then we're looking at, is there some neighbor or some? Now we're moving outside the simplest answer to the more distant answers. And at some point, we don't stop in that process until we hit an answer. And if we look at the first layer and we don't hit that answer, we move to the next layer. Now, so yes, and on my cases, they have all been explainable by the closest concentric layer to the victim. If I couldn't explain those things, well, then I'd have to assume something else. But in my cases, where I'm looking at created beings who are killing other created beings, the evidence always happens to point to a created being. So I'm able to stop at the most concentric circle. So yeah, am I open though to at some point, if it cannot be explained by any physical process involving causal agents that are material, then of course I would have to jump to another level. But I've never had to do that in my cases because, again, we start the most concentric and we work out from there. And I've always been – and once we hit a suspect that actually accounts for all the evidence, we stop looking. Gotcha. And so that's what we do. And that's what I've been able to do in all my cases. So yeah, I mean, it's not as though I'm opposed. Again, look, I'm not opposed to extranatural causes, but I don't run to extranatural causes. And I've been pretty consistent with this even in my life as a Christian, is that a lot of us as Christians will say, well, isn't God good that he did this? Or we assume God's supernatural activity is the direct first pusher over of dominoes in our lives, when in fact, this may be something way down the line. That's just there's both supernatural and natural activity we have to account for. I lived as a scientist for many years before the Enlightenment. Scientists considered both natural causes and supernatural beings, right? But we don't attribute everything immediately to God. Exactly. We start closest to the victim, basically, and we work our way out. And so I think that's what I try to do in my death investigations.
Very good, very good. Again, I'm Brady Blevins, and I'm here with J. Warner Wallace, the author of Cold Case Christianity, our book for the month. And Ken, another member of our club, asked this question. Okay. He said, there is a discrepancy in the resurrection accounts between Luke and Mark. Luke has the directive to stay in Jerusalem, but the other Gospels have the disciples meeting him in Galilee. What would you make of two eyewitnesses who disagreed on which end of the country a murder occurred?
Well, I think that's a very different claim to disagree on which end of the country a murder occurred and whether or not the disciples were either saw Jesus or were present in either Galilee or Jerusalem. So there's some basic principles that we see with eyewitness accounts. I never call these things discrepancies between eyewitness accounts when I'm working in crimes, like in homicides. The only thing I ever ask a dispatcher when being dispatched to a crime scene, it's the middle of the night, it's 2 a.m., I have to show up in a suit because detectives show up in suits, so it's going to take me a little while to get dressed. So I'm going to probably be an hour behind the call before I arrive at the crime scene. That's why sometimes, you'll be waiting around 2 hours for detectives to get someplace because we're getting up in the middle of the night, driving in, trying to get dressed before we drive in. And the only thing I ever tell the dispatcher before I leave my house is, hey, I know there are officers there with the witnesses. Make sure they separate the eyewitnesses. And the reason why that's the only directive I give dispatch is because if I don't have those officers separate the eyewitnesses, I will get there and find that I have 5 or 6 identical eyewitness statements. And that is not what I want, because that's not what helps us solve the case. We're going to get there, and if they've been separated so they can't talk to each other, then we're going to get a great variation between the accounts. I don't care if it happened 2 hours ago or 25 years ago. You're going to have a great variation between the accounts. And there'll be places in the accounts where you're going to say, I'm not even sure how that is possible, that both these people think they're telling me something true. So you just learn how to work through the variations in the accounts. Now, I think there's probably even greater apparent variations than the ones that he's mentioning here. But so, for example, on this issue about when did he see the disciples? What exactly did he say to the disciples? Well, the problem we have is that in order for there to be a contradiction, he'd have to be making the exact same claim, stating that the exact same place, time, and people were involved in both of these accounts. And the problem we have is that we know from Acts 1 that Jesus hung around for 40 days, 5 weeks, right, or whatever it would be, that 40 days. He's hanging around for 40 days. And during that time, all the gospel writers have him appearing in a variety of places, including Galilee and Jerusalem. So the question simply becomes, are we saying that he said to be in Jerusalem at the same time he one gospel? First of all, that assumes that Mark has no clue that Luke has no clue what Mark said, when in fact Mark is the most quoted line-by-line gospel in Luke's gospel. Luke says in the first verses that he was talking to all the people who he met through his journeys with Paul rather. And one of those people were all the eyewitnesses. Mark, for example, was one of the people we know that Luke had contact with because Mark's gospel is quoted so often by Luke. Yeah. So are we suggesting that somehow Luke quotes Mark more than anyone else, yet he seems to get this detail wrong when apparently he had access to the detail? Why would he get it wrong? Well, I think there's something else at play here. It's not a matter of were they supposed to be in Galilee or Jerusalem. It's when were they in Galilee and Jerusalem. And if you look at that verse, there's a couple of ways to read that. Number one, was that an entire contiguous statement from Jesus about where to be when? Or is he talking about when you do get to Jerusalem, make sure that you wait there for me, or you wait for the Holy Spirit? So there's a lot of ways to read that. And unfortunately, I don't think that any one of those excludes. But let's just go to another principle beside that. Number one, I don't think they're both early accounts. And it's clear that Luke is familiar with Mark's account. I don't think we can say he just got that one detail wrong. He's describing something entirely different. And we know that all the disciples described Jesus in a variety of places over that 40 days in which he remained with the disciples. But more importantly, let's just say that there's something wrong. Now, I don't suggest there is. But let's just say there's a detail in the Gospels in which the author gets something wrong. Okay, it's got it's something that's factually incorrect. Now, I don't think that's the case. But even if that was the case, there seems to be an assumption then that, okay, if a witness gets one thing wrong, they're done, right? Actually, not in criminal trials. We actually have a jury instruction for this that says, hey, if witnesses can be wrong about a detail yet still be deemed reliable about the overall narrative, judges instruct juries on this specifically, saying just that. And we're asked to take a look and say, well, why do you think there's a discrepancy? Is there something that might explain why he's wrong about this one detail that can't also be applied? I've had cases specifically where a woman got something wrong in her testimony, yet the jury found her reliable on the overall narrative because we have a jury instruction for that. Now, I don't think that's the case in Scripture, but even if it was, I don't think you have the necessarily intellectual wherewithal or the right to just kick everything to the curb. I think that, but again, I don't think that's actually the case. I think these are variances between eyewitnesses, and that's very common in my casework that I think we see between the Gospels.
Well, and I think that brings up a really great question that our co-founder Bill had, kind of really on that same lines, because he said this. He said, you mentioned Papias as a reliable witness in the chain of custody, but can we really count him to be reliable given some of the off-the-wall stuff he said, like his claim that Judas was so swollen in the flesh that he could not pass where a wagon could easily pass?
Okay, so Papias, I do mention Papias, but I do not use him as a reliable source, only because we don't have any content from Papias. All we have are the statements of Eusebius describing what Papias allegedly said or didn't say. So I left him out. I only looked at Polycarp and Ignatius for data points, pieces of evidence for which we could use to verify what it is that John said, because these are the students. Yes, Papias is a student, but unfortunately we don't have anything from Papias. We just have some stuff that Eusebius says that he said. So I'm willing to kind of say, okay, I can't really make a case based on what Papias says, whether or not Papias is even reliable. I made the case from Ignatius and Polycarp. Now, what's interesting about that is that this is a case, I call this death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's never that we're going to take, we have to be able to corroborate an eyewitness in some way. And so what we're looking at is, Ignatius says some things about the nature of Jesus. He allegedly is getting these from John. And also Polycarp is saying some things about Jesus. He is allegedly getting these from John. So the question is, do Ignatius's claims match Polycarp's? Do Polycarp's match Ignatius? Does Ignatius match John? Does Polycarp match? We have 3 data points now that we can compare, and that gives me more confidence than if I was just going to say, hey, I have no idea what I'm comparing to, but Papias says this, therefore I believe it. That's why I'm not somebody who jumps in and believes that all of the accounts related to the deaths of the disciples are necessarily reliable, because I don't have the same kind of trilogy of data points to look and cross-check with. Sometimes all I have about one person's death is one ancient document that says all kinds of crazy things. So I'm not committed to that as being all that reliable. But here, I didn't use Papias for that reason. I used Ignatius and Polycarp.
Gotcha. Ken asked this question. He said, you appropriately use forensic tools based on common experience.
Okay.
For example, that conspiracy theories are rarely tenable, let's say 99% of the time, yet common experience also tells us that people who die stay dead 99.99999% of the time. Shouldn't we then have the humility to question our confidence in the less than 100% certain arguments we use to build a case for such an unlikely conclusion?
Okay, so a couple of things. Every case we build, we never use percentages. We never allow jurors to talk in percentages. They'll ask us sometimes, well, what percentage do I need to be at to be beyond a reasonable doubt? Like, is that like 75% sure? Well, first of all, how in the world would we calculate that percentage? Yeah, we could say it's 99% of the time or 99.9999% of the time. We could say that, but how exactly are we arriving at that percentage point? I mean, in some communities, people would say, well, actually, and I wouldn't agree with this. I'm just saying that some people would say, hey, I think miraculous stuff happens 60% of the time. So is that really? I mean, so how are we going to, because your experience tells you this and my experience says something different. That's why we stay away from percentages. In the end, we're trying to eliminate things that are simply possible and try to focus on those things that are reasonable. Now, look, if you, up front, you've said that I could never accept any supernatural or extranatural cause as reasonable. Okay, then you're not going to accept this explanation. No problem. That's why we do such basically a diligent job of selecting juries. We want to make sure that we don't have somebody who says, hey, I could never be persuaded that this guy is your suspect. He looks just like me. Or I could never be persuaded that he isn't the suspect because he looks like somebody who would kill somebody. We want those people off our jury because we need people who are not so fixed in their position that they aren't even open to the reasonable explanation offered by any other side. And this is true for defense attorneys and for prosecutors. So in the end, if we're somebody who says, hey, I have to be at 100% certainty, or I think up front that the supernatural could be ruled out 99.99999% of the time. Well, we don't know that. That's the thing we're investigating. That's the thing we're trying to determine. And I think what happens here is that every case has more than enough evidence, every case I've ever worked and put in front of a jury, has more than enough evidence for the jury to conclude, to render a verdict. Yet, there's always enough wiggle room for a juror to hang or to say, I'm not going to agree. That's the nature of every case. There's more than enough evidence to draw an inference, but there's also enough wiggle room for somebody to say, I refuse to draw an inference. This is also the case for God, is that there's more than enough evidence to reasonably infer that God exists, but there's also enough wiggle room for people to deny it. And I think that God wants it that way. I think that this is why we don't have we have a God who's a gentleman who's not going to compel belief, because then it wouldn't really be belief. I mean, there's an act of freedom involved in even deciding which is the most reasonable inference. And if I remove that freedom from you by either overwhelming you or by designing you in such a way that you have no choice but to believe one thing or the other, you could call this love, you could call this faith, you could call this belief, but really it's just a pre-programmed, overwhelmed kind of compulsion that that God has put on you. So I think that what we have here is that every case, yes, if you think that there's enough wiggle room to deny these claims, absolutely there is. And can I remove that wiggle room for you? No. And so I'm pretty calm about that. Mm-hmm. My job is to show to the jury. I never say I'm going to prove this to you. Now, my attorneys sometimes say that, but I would never say that.
Gotcha.
I'm going to make a case for this. It may prove it to you, but proof is in the eye of the considerer or in the head of the considerer. And so I may not be able to prove it to you because that's something that your definition of proof may be so high that I need a 100% certainty, for example. that I'm never going to reach. I've never reached 100% certainty in any case I've ever tried.
Gotcha. Bill asked this question. He said, Matthew and Mark both give an account of Jesus walking on water.
Okay.
Mark, the earliest gospel, only has Jesus walking on water, but Matthew has the addition of Peter walking on water. These two stories seem to be legendary embellishments. How do you deal with this objection of legendary embellishments?
Well, if we're going to say that something that exists in one gospel that we find, we could even say is later than an earlier gospel. So if we find something in a later gospel that doesn't exist in the earlier gospel, we could certainly say, okay, that must be a late addition. But there are going to be many things, and there are many things in the earlier gospels that don't exist in the later gospels. So, I mean, if that was the case, why would you leave that out? I mean, it's happening on both sides. It's happening from early to late and from late to early. Some people report some things. Some people report others. So the question isn't just about, well, I mean, you can certainly try to argue for that. I have no problem with that, making that argument. But I think that another way you can argue for this is to say, well, look, in every witness I've ever, even if they saw it all simultaneously, they're going to have things left out. Now, I interviewed them in a certain order, and you could argue, well, he's only adding that because he heard something the first one said. Well, not necessarily. A lot of times what we see is we have a certain perspective, a certain desire on the part of eyewitnesses to portray it a certain way. Maybe the victim is their race and they are more sympathetic to the victim because of race, or to the suspect because of race, or because of lifestyle, or because of hair color. Who knows what would cause that? But I think there's many ways to look at. For example, I use in one of the chapters that I think that one of the reasons it might explain why Mark does not embarrass Peter and leave him in the boat, doesn't show him going out of the boat. There's lots of times in the Gospel of Mark when Mark portrays Peter in the kindest possible way. Either he eliminates his stupid statements, or he eliminates his stupid behavior, or he tries to say everybody else was just as stupid. I mean, he does things, and it's not surprisingly, Mark is closest probably to Peter than any of the disciples. He was his scribe sitting at his feet in Rome. So I think that there may be another reason, another way to explain. So I never assume I know exactly why there's a variance between eyewitness accounts. I can certainly make some inferences, but I don't know that any one of those inferences is necessarily more or less reasonable. I actually think it's more reasonable because I see so many other places where Mark is kinder to Peter than any other gospel writer, that Mark may show some variations on Peter's activity just based on his relationship with Peter.
Thank you so much for that. I'm Brady Blevins, and you're watching right now the Atheist Christian Book Club, our interview with this month's author of Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace. We got one more question for you here from Ken. He said your pre-70 dating of the Gospels is based primarily on the lack of mention of certain key events like the destruction of Jerusalem or the death of Paul. Can we not use the same reasoning you employ for dating Acts early to argue that Mark knew nothing of Jesus' resurrection appearances to his disciples, since Mark doesn't make any mention of them in his gospel, apart from the spurious ending of chapter 16?
Well, it's kind of related to the question we just asked. The question is, the broader question is, why is something either included or missing? I do agree that Mark is the earliest gospel, and it's no surprise that it's also the shortest gospel. The question then becomes, well, why would Mark's gospel be shorter than the rest? Well, it also, if you look at it, has the most kind of emotion words in it and the most kind of action words in it. So there's something about Mark that reflects a sense of action and urgency. Even skeptical scholars will kind of at least admit that. Now, I think you might also, though, since it's first, and it's a sense of urgency and action and emotion, and it's charged in a way that the other gospels aren't charged. It seems like it's the gospel that says, hey, it's a do this gospel. And I see this all the time when crimes occur, that the closer to the actual crime, the narrative of the crime is always more urgent. We give a broadcast. We broadcast a quick first broadcast is just to get the data out to people. Why? Because we think we might catch these bad guys. So right away, the first account on the radio is going to be, I have a murder here, last seen two white male suspects wearing a red jacket running eastbound on Hawthorne. Okay, fine. So now we've got a rough location, what the crime is, got a rough description of the suspects and their last direction of travel. There's a lot more that officer could have said, but he's only saying enough to get officers who are in the area to be active in looking for the suspect. Now, as time goes by, the final report of this is going to be as in-depth as possible because they've already been caught. I think it's clear from Scripture that the authors of Scripture believed, for whatever reason, that Jesus would return very soon, within their lifetimes, perhaps. And so a lot of what's left out of the earliest accounts, Mark's account particularly, it's a crime broadcast. It's like, hey, we need to act now. Jesus is coming back. You guys need to know the data. And so it's a very brief, very charged for action, very emotionally charged gospel. I think that's another way to read that gospel that is every bit as fair. As we get into Matthew or into Luke, we get much more detailed accounts because now you've got Luke traveling with Paul. The ascension's already occurred, and we're much further along in the timeline than I think we were with Mark. I think there's a sense of urgency in Mark's gospel. And think about it, this is written early, and there's a sense of urgency. The eyewitnesses to the resurrection are still available to the first hearers, to the first writers of these Gospels. Those eyewitnesses are still alive. And so there's a sense in which as we move further and further away from the actual resurrection, that the accounts become more detailed, that it can be explained in a number of ways. If you think it can be explained by just late editions, of course it could. Of course, but is that the most reasonable way to explain it? And that's where I think we would disagree.
Ken asked another question. He said, you appeal to the authority of the most critical Bible scholars in establishing Habermas and Lycona's minimal facts, yet you also take several positions not held by most mainstream biblical scholars. For example, the dating of the New Testament that has concluded that Mark was written in the late 60s, Matthew in the 80s, Luke in the 90s, John early in the 2nd century. Why appeal to the majority opinion of mainstream scholars to support the resurrection while rejecting mainstream scholarly opinion on these other matters?
Okay, so maybe there's a misunderstanding about how I'm using Habermas and Lycona. So Gary Habermas and Mike Lycona are friends, but I would say we probably disagree on far more than we actually agree on. And I'll be honest, I love Gary's work, and looking at the minimal facts. That's really a Gary Habermas work. And I'm using a book. I talk about it in a book that he wrote with Mike Lycona called The Resurrection of Jesus. But I will tell you that I don't think that that's necessarily a persuasive argument for the resurrection to appeal to the minimal facts that scholars reference, even skeptical scholars reference when talking about the resurrection. I just wanted to give that list because I was setting up what I would have said as a skeptic. So when I first looked at this, I knew that we had to take a list of evidences in the room and then a list of possible explanations and figure out which of these possible explanations makes the most sense, is the most reasonable in light of the evidences. Now, Gary and Mike might say there are 15 or so, or 13, I forget how many they list, that are the minimal facts that they would use as evidence. As a skeptic, I rejected all of those except for 4. There were only 4 that I would have said, looking at that list. So, yeah, Gary can just kind of anecdotally tell us what scholarship thinks about these different data points. I didn't care what scholarship thought about the data points, and I still don't care what scholarship thinks about the data points. What I care is what are the data points. And I'm going to make my own inference. Sorry. I mean, I'm just arrogant enough to think that all of us as jurors, and I think most of the skeptics who you're dealing with right now on this podcast, on this question, they aren't probably scholars either, yet they think they can make a reasonable inference from facts. I do too. I think we do this all the time in juries. We tell people who are just post office deliverers, they're just like you and me. We're just people who are regular folks, engineers and teachers, and just people who have no expertise in this area. That we tell them we're going to give you the power, not the experts we call. We're going to give you the power to render a verdict. The experts don't get a vote. You're the only ones who get a vote. And we're going to do that. Yeah, I can listen to experts testify, but you're free to also say those experts are crazy. I think it's this. So I think the same is true for us. I have no problem with experts who might gather data, but I get to decide if I want to use that data, if I think that data is reasonable. So they've gathered 13, 14, 15. I forget what they actually gathered in their book on minimal facts, but I reject all of those but 4. Yeah. The 4 are the 4 that I would have said as an atheist. I'll give you these. I'll give you these claims about Jesus. That he lived. I'm not a Jesus mythic. I think there's more than enough good evidence to suggest that this dude, Jesus of Nazareth, lived. And even that he died on a cross. But that doesn't mean he rose from the grave. But I will give you that one data point. So I like I said earlier, I want to listen to what Bart has to say about his assessment of these facts. But in the end, I'm going to have to go back to the facts and draw my own inference.
Thank you so much. If you're just joining us, you're watching the Atheist Christian Book Club's interview of this month's author. Our book is Cold Case Christianity, and the author is J. Warner Wallace. I'm Brady Blevins. And let's just jump into this next question here. This is also from Ken. He says, regarding many of the undesigned coincidences you cite, could any of them be explained if the authors of later Gospels had access to earlier Gospels or to shared sources?
Okay, so what I tried to do, and there's a guy named J.J. Blunt who wrote about this in the 19th century, and he's got a book called Undesigned Coincidences. More recently, Lydia McGrew has got a book on undesigned coincidences. I would refer any of this questioning to Lydia's book because she addresses that issue specifically in every one of the undesigned coincidences. What I tried to do was to limit myself to those, because J.J. Blunt, he mentions a bunch that he considers to be undesigned coincidences. I don't think all of them have great evidential value. So I tried to restrict myself to just those that I thought had potential evidential value. And I don't even think, like everything else, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. When I do a case, it's built on 50 pieces of evidence that all point to the one reasonable inference. But any one of these pieces of evidence you would look at and say, really? That doesn't seem all that great. Well, yeah, it's not. It's a paper cut. It's when you get 1,000 million paper cuts, then you're stuck with the result of 1,000 paper cuts. So I think that's what I look at in terms of undesigned coincidences. The best work, though, because I didn't parse out every single one and make the case for why the best inference is an undesigned coincidence rather than just copying or whatever it may be. Just because this isn't the kind of book this is. But the best book on that right now is Lydia McGrew's book on undesigned coincidences. I did write the afterword on that book, but she does a great job because she's just that kind of mind that she just doesn't let anything rest until she's kind of turned that thing over 1,000 times in her hand. So that's a great book for that source.
Yeah, we got the opportunity to actually have Tim McGrew in person for a special book club. Here comes the last question for you, and thank you so much for sticking around and answering all these for us. The last one is this, and it's also from Ken. What was the purpose of intense animal suffering over millions of years before humans walked the earth? Starvation, disease, parasites, predation, fires, etc. How does the following passage relate to this reality, or is it merely poetic? And the passage is this. It comes from Psalm 145, verses 15 through 17, and the passage says this: the eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and loving toward all he has made.
Well, so we're going to end on this question. Okay, good. So I don't think, address this question at all in Cold Case Christianity, but I did address it in an entire chapter in God's Crime Scene, which is a book that makes a case for God's existence from 8 attributes of the universe, one of which is the existence of evil and suffering. And does this point away from God? Is it a piece of exculpating evidence, or is it an inculpating piece of evidence that actually can be used and should be used in the case for God's existence? So the real question is broader than this, right? Is that, number one, how could there be an all-loving, all-powerful God that allows this much death and destruction over the course of history? Is that something that would exclude God as a potential cause, given the amount of – because how can you be all-loving and allow this? I mean, if you don't care to stop it, you can't call yourself all-loving. And if you can't stop it, then you can't call yourself all-powerful. So either you're not all-powerful or you're not all-loving, or you just don't exist. So I think that's a worthy, and unfortunately the answer is rather long. And in the chapter I talk about 7 reasons why I think an all-loving, all-powerful God would allow any act of evil to occur. Because I get this question more often than not from victims' families. When your 10-year-old girl has been murdered brutally, and that family at some point, if they're believers, are going to ask that question. How could there be an all-loving, all-powerful God and allow this to happen to my 10-year-old daughter? And you have to think about that, right? I can tell you that the answers are rather intellectual, and they will not be emotionally satisfying, because nothing really is emotionally satisfying. But in terms of, if I can kind of capture the essence of this objection specifically, this idea that the universe has a history of death and destruction leading up to mankind. Why would God ever allow that to happen? Well, there's an assumption here. The first assumption is that the only life that anything in the universe can live is the life that occurs on this side of a grave. Is not a Christian notion or a theistic notion. It's an atheistic notion. According to Christianity, you don't die at 90 or whenever you do die. You just pass from one stage of life to another. If the Christian worldview is true, then your life is not a line segment from birth to death. It's a ray from birth through the point we call death and on into eternity. And all of our suffering, if you think about it, is always measured in the context of what we think our life is. If you suffer for 60 years before you die at 70, I can see why you'd be complaining. On the other hand, if you suffered for 2 years, your first 2 years you were born, by the time you're 10, you've already forgotten about it. You're already over it. Why? Because suffering is always in the context of your what you can think is your life. You're either temporal, but if we're right as Christians, this is eternal. And if you're 1,000 years into eternity, I don't care what the first 60 years look like, it's got to be measured in the context of 1,000 years. And then when it's 1,000,000 years, it's got to be measured in the context of 1,000,000 years. If the Christian worldview is true, I'm not saying right now that it is, but if it is, as a thought experiment, well, then it changes the way we look at evil or suffering or pain. One more thing about that. It kind of sounds like the question is somewhat similar to this idea that if God's going to create us in this position, why would there be so much death and destruction prior to this? Well, remember, death and destruction is an illusion if the Christian worldview is true, because we know that we have a life beyond the grave. That's number one. Number two, if I asked you to bake me just a little muffin for my birthday, and put a candle on it, well, what do you have to do in order to get that muffin? Well, you would say, okay, I'll make it for you. You're going to go to the store and get a mix? No, you can't make it from a mix. I want you to make that muffin for me from scratch. I want a bran muffin with raisins in it. Okay, so now how am I going to get that from scratch? It means you're going to have to start with a big patch of ground you can plant some wheat in, because I'm going to need you to grind that wheat to get the wheat. Oh, you need sugar? Oh, I'm going to need you to plant sugar cane and get that sugar. Oh, you need raisins? I need you to plant raisins, make sure they're dead and dried up, plant grapes rather, make sure they're dead and dried up to get raisins. In other words, if I had to get all the ingredients from zero to create this muffin, I'm going to leave a trail of destruction and a huge body of work, an area of destruction, all of which was destroyed just to get this little thing. Well, I just don't know that. I think that we have good reason to believe that in order for God to get us where we are, the universe had to have a history that is used a certain way, the same way we use all that material to make the muffin, just to get the world we live on, which sounds sad, right? Unless, of course, the Christian worldview is true and death is not at the end of your 90 years, or if you're whatever, but as actually we are in an eternal state from the moment we're born. Well, that's a little bit different in terms of how you assess this. But I think in God's currency, what I try to do is give you seven reasons. The same thing happens when you're a parent and you have to do something that your kids perceive as unjust or wrong, and you treat me this way, and you've got good reasons why you know this has to happen in order for the good thing you're trying to achieve with your kids. The problem is your kids don't see those 7 things. I think sometimes we're the same way with God, and that's what I try to do in that one chapter, is give you 7 reasons why God might allow any act of evil. And do I know what that relationship is? Do I know what his primary goal is and his secondary goal? No. Do I know what the relationships between those 7 things are in any one act of evil? No. Do I know, what is his, what the, how to put the puzzle together so I can, no, I don't know any of those things, but I do think the puzzle pieces are there, and we simply have to, look at those puzzle pieces and realize, yeah, I can see there might be good reasons why God would allow this.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for being on with us. Again, this is the Atheist Christian Book Club. I am Brady Blevins, and we have with us here the author of our book, Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace, and I just want to thank you again for taking the time to answer our questions. We've enjoyed reading your book and considering what you've had for us.
Thanks, Brady. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim.